A very good day to all you Patriots out there, and welcome back to TallShip Tuesday. I'm Captain John Paul Jones, here again with another story from our Young Patriots book. Today's story is entitled New Day in Savannah, and it highlights some of the friction and relationships that occurred in between family members who perhaps believed different sides of this conflict were the correct side. "Swear it," Ben said fiercely. "Swear your allegiance to the king." He sat on Nathaniel's chest, pinning his arms to the floor. Nathaniel struggled to break free, but at 13, he was no match for his 16-year-old brother. Still, he would not give in. "Never," he gasped. "Old George is not my king. Not anymore." He twisted to the right. Caught off balance, Ben lost his grip. Nathaniel jerked his arms free, turned and leaped to his feet. "You and Father don't want to see it, but it's true," he said. He stood with his back against the painted, panelled wall of the parlour. "The war was over when the Redcoats surrendered at Yorktown. Now General Wayne is getting ready to free Savannah. We're going to be a new country." "Not Savannah," said Ben. "Savannah will never surrender to the rebels." But he made no move to fight with his brother again. Instead, he said softly, "You'd better hold your tongue. Father does not like to hear such talk. You might get away from me, but if Father wants to give you a thrashing, he will." Nathaniel knew that all too well. During most of the War for Independence, Savannah had been occupied and controlled by the British Army. His father had been born in England and, like many wealthy plantation owners, had no wish to separate from the mother country. Ben sided with his father, but not Nathaniel. He was closer to his mother, who had been born in this new land. He never forgot the day she had taken him to hear the Declaration of Independence read at Savannah's Reynolds Square. It was 6 years ago, and he still remembered the cheers and his mother's words. "Someday, Nathaniel, this will be a new country, where men can make their own laws." He never spoke of that day at home anymore, not since his mother died of fever 2 years before. He knew what defending the Patriots would bring. "Hold your tongue, lad," his father would say, sometimes following his words with a sharp slap. So Nathaniel would sneak over to the adjoining McGinnis plantation, where his friend James lived. The McGinnises were dedicated patriots. Nathaniel didn't have to hold his tongue there. He and James could talk about the War for Independence and cheer for each colonial victory. James's father would always nod and say, "Well done, boys, and well said. We have to get these foreigners off our soil, and we will someday, and then Savannah will be free." Now, Nathaniel needed to hear those cheering words again. He turned away from Ben and escaped to the wide porch that shaded the front of the big plantation house. He had just enough time to see James before dinner. Maybe there was news about when General Wayne would arrive. But just then, his father bounded up the steps, frowning and muttering to himself. Nathaniel heard snatches of "scoundrels. Never thought it would come to this," before his father saw him and stopped. "Nathaniel," he said, "come inside. I have word from the governor. We must make plans to leave Savannah." "Leave Savannah? But why? Where will we go?" "Home," his father said. "Home to England. Now come." Nathaniel slowly followed his father back to the parlour. Governor Wright had been ordered to vacate the city and leave it to the rebels, his father was saying to Ben. All those loyal to the crown must be given safe passage to England. He looked at his sons. "We will take whatever we can carry and sail down the river to Tybee Island. The British fleet will pick us up there." For the first time, he smiled. "It will be good to see old England, lads. And you, I'll send you to the finest schools. You will no longer be ignorant colonials." "How long will the voyage be?" asked Ben. His brown eyes were wide with excitement. He had listened well to his father's tales of life on the big estate in England. "Will we get to see London?" "Where are the fine schools?" Nathaniel said nothing. Leave Savannah? Leave Georgia? Impossible. You could see the rice fields and surrounding marshes through the long parlour windows. An egret took flight, soaring above the grasses. Just beyond was the Savannah River, where he and James cooled off during the long hot summers, and on the hill behind his house was his mother's grave. Nathaniel's heart still ached from missing her, and he visited her grave often. No, he couldn't leave. But how could he stay? His father broke into Nathaniel's thoughts. "And you, lad, have you nothing to say?" "I don't want to go," Nathaniel blurted out. "This is my home." "But England will be home too," said Ben. "And what an adventure to sail across the ocean!" But to Nathaniel, the real adventure would be to own a successful plantation in a new country. "I don't care," he said. "It is of no matter what you want," his father said sternly. "You are my son, and you are coming with me." His voice softened. "You will become a fine English gentleman, Nathaniel. You'll see." Nathaniel tried again. "But what about the plantation?" "Do you think the rebels will let us keep the plantation, knowing we were loyal to the king?" his father answered. "Not likely from what I have heard. No, this is the best we can do. We are lucky to escape with our lives. Now, look to your belongings. We will leave on the morning tide." He strode out of the room. Ben followed, peppering his father with questions about England. Nathaniel walked onto the porch and sat down on the steps. Although it was late afternoon, the summer sun still hung high in the sky. Everything was hushed in the heat. He breathed in the damp scent of the earth and pine from the nearby forest. He could not leave this place. He would not. He didn't believe they would lose the plantation. After all, he was a patriot. Dinner stretched on forever. Nathaniel pushed the shrimp and rice around his plate. Every word his father said made the knot in his stomach tighter. Who cared about fancy carriages and castles when they could have salt marshes and rice fields and tall oaks for climbing? His mind skipped from one escape plan to another. Finally, the two boys were sent upstairs to pack. Nathaniel followed Ben to their large room at the top of the stairs. He would pack, but not for England. He would go to James's father and offer to serve his plantation. He knew more about rice production than many grown men. Nathaniel told Ben he was going to visit their mother's grave once more and slipped quietly out of the house. The setting sun gave the large oak trees, draped with Spanish moss, a golden glow. A whippoorwill called as Nathaniel neared the McGinnis plantation. "Why, Nathaniel," said Mr. McGinnis, who was standing on the porch of the large plantation house. "What brings you here so late? No matter coming. We have news. A messenger has just left." He opened the front door, shouting inside, "James, look who's here!" Nathaniel felt the man's warm hand on his shoulder as they entered the familiar parlour. "Nathaniel," cried James, leaping to his feet. "We've just heard. The Patriots will enter Savannah tomorrow. The war is really over. And we'll be rid of those wicked Tories too. They're heading back to England," Nathaniel interrupted. "I know. My father is among them." His voice was flat, holding none of James's excitement. James had been heading toward Nathaniel, but stopped in his tracks. "Surely your father's not leaving. I know he's a Tory, but how can he?" "Who will stay here with you and Ben?" He paused. "Oh no. He doesn't mean to take you, does he?" "Well, you can't leave. And he can't make you." James turned to his father, who still stood in the doorway, his hand on Nathaniel's shoulder. "Can he, father?" Mr. McGinnis sighed. "I'm afraid he can." Nathaniel stepped away from Mr. McGinnis. He looked into the man's eyes. "That is why I have come, sir," he said. He pulled himself up as tall as he could. "I wish to offer my services to your plantation. I can work in the rice fields or oversee the workers in the mill. I've learned much from my father." Mr. McGinnis smiled. "Nathaniel, I would be happy to take you into my family, but not as a worker. As a son, But your father is your father. You are under his authority. Then I'll run away, said Nathaniel. I'll join the army. That's what... Thump, thump. Someone was pounding on the door. Then, open up, McInnes. I know my son is in there. I'll have you charged with kidnapping. It's my father, Nathaniel gasped. Mr. McInnes opened the door. Please come, he said, as Nathaniel's father stalked into the room. The angry man grabbed Nathaniel by the shoulder. No talk, he said. You are coming with me. Nathaniel wrenched free. I cannot, he said. And you must not accuse Mr. McInnes of kidnapping. I came here on my own. He took another step back. How could he make his father understand? I'm sorry, father, he said, but I cannot leave my home. The rice fields and marshes are all I know. And you taught me about them. You and mother, don't you remember? The room was quiet. Then Nathaniel's father slowly moved to an upholstered chair in the parlour and sat down heavily. The anger left his face. He looked old and tired. I do remember our good times, he said, but your mother is gone, and I am so weary of fighting. I just want to go home, back to England. And I need to stay here, Nathaniel said. It is my home. His father sighed again. Ah, Nathaniel, you are so like your mother. She loved this land too. He put out his hand. Come here, lad. Don't be afraid. I'll not force you to leave. Nathaniel moved closer. His father put an arm around his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, it was a gentle touch. Will you watch over the boy? Nathaniel's father asked Mr. McInnes. Perhaps he can climb the plantation someday. Mr. McInnes nodded. I'll watch both him and your plantation. Nathaniel looked at his father. Suddenly he was torn. If he stayed, he'd never see his father again, or Ben. His brother had slipped into the room. Don't stay, Nathaniel, he said. Come with us, please. For a moment Nathaniel hesitated. Then he heard the whippoorwill again, and felt the soft evening air. He thought of his mother's grave on the hill. This land was part of him, and he was part of it. He knew he couldn't leave. I'm sorry, he said, giving Ben a hug, but I have to stay. Nathaniel's father stood up. He squeezed Nathaniel's shoulder gently. Keep your mother's gravesite well tended, he said. Then he turned to Ben. Come along. We'd best hurry if we're to get packed. The rebels will be arriving soon to take over the city. Nathaniel stayed on the front porch long after they had left. When the sun began to rise over the rice fields, he could picture his father and Ben in a small boat, sailing east down the river to Tybee Island. There they would wait for British ships to take them back to England. But it was a new day in Savannah, and he would stay to build a new country. Aye. A bit of a sad tale, that one is, but not an uncommon one. In fact, there were several fathers and sons who were at odds in many broken relationships that exist during this war, including Benjamin Franklin and his own son disagreed on different sides of the war. Well, I do suppose there's a lot to leave you there to think with, so I do thank you for your time and I bid you a good day.